morning class. This is the Econ 512, Introduction to International Trade class. Today is January 27th, 2022, Thursday. So class will review chapter 1 through 3 in order to prepare for your next week, the first exam. So let's remember the topic of the week 1. And week 1 is overview of international trade and characteristics of national economies. And also we discussed what goods the countries trade and what goods export and what goods import. In chapter 2, we discussed the basic question regarding international trade topics like why international trade occur, and what are the benefits of the international trade, and what are the costs incurred from the international trade. And also we discussed what goods a country export or import, and how much of the volume of the trade the country will involve, and at what prices the goods and services are traded. So in chapter 3, we discussed the basic international trade model. So we started with the traditional international trade model developed by Adam Smith, and also David Ricardian's model, which is called Comparative Advantage for the international trade, and general equilibrium solution of the classical model. So those chapter 3 topics are covered by the classical model of international trade. And after the first exam, and then starting week 5, we will move on to more the modern theory of international trade. So let's go back to chapter 1 and my summary of chapter 1 video we will watch.
This chapter discusses a model of an economy that explicitly incorporates international trade and finance. We begin by discussing aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The aggregate demand, AD, and aggregate supply, AS, curves look a lot like supply and demand in a single market. Price is on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal. Because we are discussing aggregate quantities, however, we do not have a price for a single good or service, but a price index instead. The price index measures the average price level for all goods and services produced in an economy. Similarly, the quantity value on the horizontal axis is not the quantity of a single good or service, but is the total output of the economy, or gross domestic product, GDP. The aggregate demand curve shows the quantity of goods and services demanded or purchased at different price levels. The curve slopes down to the right. Aggregate supply is the quantity of all goods and services supplied and slopes up to the right, similar to a supply curve for a single good. Note the 3 different regions of the AS curve: a horizontal region that is well below full employment, an upward-sloping region that is around the level of output when the economy is at full employment, and a vertical or nearly vertical region that is beyond the level of full employment. The different regions reflect the trade-offs between price changes and quantity changes when demand is below, approximately at, or above a level consistent with full employment. Many economic fluctuations originate with sudden shifts in aggregate demand. For example, if businesses suddenly become pessimistic and stop investing for the future, demand falls, but if they are suddenly optimistic, demand might rise as they increase investment. Reminder, in macroeconomics, investment means creating real capital, buildings and machines. Similarly, households may lose confidence in the economy and cut back on their purchases, or they may become bullish and increase purchases. Any change in demand for goods and services by households, businesses, government, or foreigners that buy our exports will move the aggregate demand curve if it is a large enough change in spending. This graph shows an economy in equilibrium near full employment. An increase in demand shifts the AD curve right. This could be caused by an increase in household spending or in the spending by any other economic actor that is large enough to affect the entire economy. In this case, the economy is near full employment. The increase in aggregate demand causes both the price level and output to increase. When the economy is in a recession and at a level of output that is significantly below full employment, governments may choose to use expansionary fiscal or monetary policies to push output back towards the full employment level of output. Fiscal policies are policies that change spending through changes in government spending and/or taxation. Monetary policy changes spending through its effects on interest rates. As interest rates rise, investment spending falls, and some long-term consumer spending for cars and appliances will likely fall as well. A decline in interest rates has the opposite effect. An increase in demand shifts the AD curve right. Because the economy is so far below full employment, it's possible to increase output without causing the price level to rise. Here we have an economy that is above full employment. Changes in aggregate demand mostly change the price level. The government can choose to use contractionary fiscal or monetary policy to reduce the level of output and decrease the upward pressure on prices. The shift in aggregate demand in Figure 11.2 can be viewed as the outcomes of either expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. AD shifts right, which represents an increase in spending, so either government increased its spending, or government reduced taxes so that businesses and households might spend more, or the central bank lowered interest rates and businesses and households spend more. Historically, fiscal policy was widely heralded as a cure for the business cycle. In the 1950s and 1960s, it seemed that governments had finally discovered a way to offset the unpredictable fluctuations in the economy using changes in government spending and taxes. In the 1960s, economists coined the phrase fine-tuning to describe how well they believed they could manage the economy. A better word would have been hubris. The problems that government eventually encountered with fiscal policy were numerous. It was hard to predict exactly how much change in government spending or taxation was necessary to move the economy by the desired amount. In addition, fiscal policy is cumbersome since it requires changes in spending that often have to pass through a legislature that may not be in complete agreement. Finally, economists forgot a basic principle. Temporary changes in taxes and spending do not have the same impact as permanent changes. For these and other reasons, monetary policy gradually came to be relied on more often than fiscal policy as a tool for managing the level of economic activity. In the 1990s and the first part of the 2000s, it was thought that monetary policy was the key to maintaining the economy on a full employment and low inflation growth path. However, the financial crisis and recession of 2007 to 2009 demonstrated that monetary policy does not always work as planned. Once expansionary monetary policy pushes interest rates down to zero, they cannot go lower. And yet it still may not be enough to stimulate more spending by households and businesses.
The last time we talked about the market, we put the supply and the demand together and came up with the equilibrium price and quantity traded. That was a case where the market was closed to trade. That is, all the supply and all the demand were within the economy. This time, we're going to study international trade. We're going to use the supply and the demand diagram with one addition. In the case of international trade, we're going to consider a market or a country that can bring more of the good in from the outside. That is, it can import. Alternatively, this same market or country can sell more of its good to the outside world. That is, it can export. In this case, rather than determining an equilibrium price and quantity, we'll be determining an equilibrium volume of international trade. Imports or exports. Now we're going to be using the same tools that we used before with one modification. Let's look at it. The demand curve this time represents the demand of all of those people who live within the market or the country. To make this more concrete, let's suppose we're talking about a country like France and a product like this one. This is a pomelo, the world's largest citrus fruit. Now, there are not a lot of these that are actually grown in France because the climate isn't suitable, and it would be very expensive, that is a large opportunity cost, for the French to give up the other goods that they would have to give up to make these pomelos. So the pomelo is imported. On this curve, we're representing the demand of people in France for pomelos. At each price, there is a quantity that the people in France will want to buy of the pomelo, given their income, the price of substitutes, the price of complements, expectations, and all of those other factors that influence demand. Let's look now at the supply curve. This is the supply curve for pomelos in France. That is, the domestic supply curve. This curve tells you at each price for pomelos how many of them are actually produced by farmers in France itself. This supply curve refers to the supply of pomelos domestically. So I'll go ahead and put a little sub D in my diagram to remind me that this is the supply of domestic farmers. The demand curve is the demand for pomelos domestically. So I'll put a little d here to remind me that these are the people in the market itself in France who want to buy different quantities of pomelos at different prices. Now, if this were a closed economy, the price of the pomelo would be determined where the supply curve and the demand curve meet. That is, there is only one price at which the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. That is, there is one price at which we have an equilibrium. And the quantity demanded of pomelos is on the quantity axis below that intersection. But this is going to be a different story. Rather than considering the closed economy, we're going to consider an open economy. And we represent the open economy by inserting a world price line. The world price line reminds us that as far as pomelos are concerned, France is a small country. That means the farmers in France can produce as many pomelos as they're capable of without producing so many that they actually affect the world price. People in France can buy all the pomelos that they might be inclined to buy, also without influencing the world price. Most of the pomelos in the world are grown outside of France, and most of them are consumed outside of France. So as far as this particular fruit is concerned, France is a small country, a country without influence on the world price. So we can put the world price in our diagram, and it's going to be a constant. No matter how many pomelos are supplied and demanded in France, there will be no effect on the world price. Let's put the line in. Suppose the world price for pomelos is right here, P sub W. This is the world price, and we might imagine that it's $1 per pomelo. That is, you can buy or sell all the pomelos you want to on the world market for $1 a piece. So I'm going to let this line go across the diagram. It represents the opportunity for international trade. It represents the opportunity to buy and sell outside of France, that is, in the rest of the world, at a price of $1 per pomelo. Now, with a world price given at $1, people in France are always going to have the opportunity to buy pomelos for $1 a piece from someone outside of France. They might import them from Spain or Africa or somewhere else. Any farmer who produces pomelos in France has to compete with these imports. That is, they have to compete with farmers other places who are able to produce and sell pomelos for $1. That is, no one will pay more than $1 because of the alternative to import the good, and no farmer can charge more than $1 because otherwise he or she would be undercut by competition. So what happens in this market? The world price is fixed. France is a small country, and it takes this world price as given. What then do the people of France do? Well, let's look at our supply and demand curves, which represent the behavior of people in this market. On the blue curve, we can see what the French farmers are going to do when the price of pomelos is set at $1 per fruit. That is, they can cover the opportunity cost of producing only a few pomelos before the opportunity cost rises to the point where it's no longer profitable for them to make the fruit. The quantity supplied domestically will be given by this intersection. This intersection tells us the quantity that the French farmers can afford to supply. So we'll use a QSD to represent the domestic quantity supplied. Going over to the demand curve, we see how many pomelos French customers want to buy at a price of $1 each. This is the quantity that people in France are willing and able to purchase at the price PW, maybe $1 per pomelo. Notice that the quantity demanded is a much larger quantity than the quantity supplied. The quantity demanded domestically is very large because French people find the pomelos to be a bargain and are very happy to buy a lot of them. Now, here's where international trade is different than the closed economy. In the closed economy, you couldn't have a situation where the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Remember, we called that excess demand. And when excess demand is present, the bidding mechanism pushes up the price of the good until we return to equilibrium. In this case, however, we imagine that because international trade is possible, the quantity demanded domestically can be larger than the quantity supplied domestically. It's possible for people in France to eat more pomelos than French farmers produce. How do they do it? They import the difference between the domestic demand and the domestic supply. The difference between these 2 points represents the quantity of pomelos that are imported in equilibrium. In the international trade equilibrium, we don't determine the price. The price is given from outside. What we do determine is the difference between the quantity supplied domestically and the quantity demanded domestically. That is, the volume of imports. And the volume of imports will depend on domestic supply, domestic demand, and the world price. So, to summarize, with international trade, instead of finding the place where the curves intersect, you put in the world price line and find the difference between the quantity supplied domestically and the quantity demanded domestically. This is our equilibrium. I was about to eat this orange, and it occurred to me to wonder where it had come from. Did this orange grow in Florida? Workers from Florida tended the trees, picked the orange, boxed the oranges, and sent them to the supermarket? If so, my purchase of this orange provided jobs for people in Florida, in the U.S. economy. What if this orange came from Mexico, on the other hand? Then workers in Mexico tended the trees, picked the oranges, and boxed them. My purchase of this orange created employment for workers in Mexico. Now, the difference is that if this orange was produced in the U.S. economy, my purchase of it stimulated the U.S. economy by creating demand for a product that's produced here. And if wages are sticky, that is, if they don't tend to adjust downwards very quickly, then if I move my consumption of products from oranges produced in Florida to oranges produced in Mexico, I may have created unemployment in Florida by causing workers who originally tended trees in Florida to no longer have jobs. This is a concern. Now, of course, as a consumer, I want to buy my oranges from wherever the oranges are least expensively produced. That is, I'm looking for the country that produces oranges with comparative advantage, where the sun shines a lot, where the workers are industrious, and where they know something about orange production, because those are the workers that are going to be able to get the oranges on my table at lowest price. However, if my microeconomic sense leads me to buy oranges where the price is lowest and the cost of production is lowest, then, on the other hand, I've got the macroeconomic concern of unemploying workers in the U.S. who were previously producing oranges and who can't compete with foreign competition. Now, in a microeconomic classical view of the world, wages and prices would all adjust, and the workers who previously made oranges would find new jobs, maybe in the software industry or producing automobiles or something like that. But if we're in a macroeconomic world where wages and prices don't adjust instantly, then my shift of consumption from domestically produced products to imports creates a period of adjustment, that is unemployment and cost to the domestic economy. This is a question that is answered in open economy macroeconomics, the approach to macroeconomics that focuses on our country embedded in a larger world economy, where we import goods from abroad and export goods to foreigners. We're now going to begin a series of discussions about open economy macroeconomics and see what difference it makes when you're conscious of the fact that your economy, your country, is only one part of a larger world with which your economy interacts. Now, we've already had a taste of open economy macroeconomics when we considered net exports. Let's begin with the notion of exports. Exports are goods and services that are produced in our economy that are purchased by people in other countries. So the good thing about exports is they provide employment for local resources, and they create income for local resources, which ends up being spent and respent in your economy through the multiplier effect. So exports are good because they are demand for local production, they create income for local resources, and they have a multiplier effect in the domestic economy. Imports, on the other hand, are good because they provide goods and services for people in your economy. They are goods and services that are purchased from abroad. So if I import an orange, the good thing about that is I get to enjoy an orange. That is, my standard of living goes up if I can buy an orange inexpensively from Mexico. On the other hand, the more of my income I spend on imported goods and services, the more I'm creating jobs for people in Mexico, which is great for them, but is not so good for the people in Florida who might otherwise have produced this orange. So imports are good because they increase your satisfaction from goods and services, but they're costly in a macroeconomic sense because it's income that's leaking out of your domestic economy, and therefore it's reducing the multiplier effect, because you're creating multiplier consequences in some other country, not in your own. Now, the difference between exports and imports is what we call in macroeconomics net exports. Net exports is the difference between what you're selling to foreigners and what you're buying from them. Net exports is adding to the domestic demand. Net exports is the net addition to domestic demand from your foreign trade. So international trade, then, has a macroeconomic consequence through net exports. The difference between what you're sending foreigners and what you're buying from them is demand for your locally produced products. This is creating income in your economy, and through the multiplier effect, creating more consumption, more income, and so forth, leading your domestic economy to grow. Now let's look at how we show net exports in the diagram that represents aggregate spending. This is the diagram that we used when we were building Keynes's model of the economy, but you can see that it applies generally to, even in the more sophisticated aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, there's some notion of spending somewhere. We start with consumer spending. It's an upward sloping line that has here an intercept representing autonomous spending, and the slope of this consumption function is the marginal propensity to consume. Remember, the marginal propensity to consume is the amount of each additional dollar of income that a household spends on consumer goods and services. So, for example, if the marginal propensity to consume is 90% or 0.9, then out of every additional dollar of income that the household gets, a horizontal movement, that household will spend 90 cents, the vertical movement, or the rise. So rise over run, the slope of this line, is the marginal propensity to consume. Now, let's add on to this consumption function some other autonomous components of spending that are not influenced by income. That is, we're going to shift the line upwards in a parallel fashion, but we're not going to change its slope. So if we add on investment spending and government spending, we shift the aggregate expenditure line upwards. We've added some more components of autonomous spending, and we get this line right here. Now, this is how things would look in a closed economy. This is all the spending that's done as a function of income if business and government and consumers are all registering their demand in the economy. Notice I haven't added foreigners yet. I haven't added any foreign spending. This is our spending line, aggregate expenditure in a closed economy. Now, let's look at what a difference an open economy makes. The first component of the open economy is going to be exports. And we're going to imagine that exports are autonomous. That is, they don't depend on income. Why would that be? Because exports are the demand of foreigners, people in other countries who want to buy goods from our economy. They don't care what our income is in this country. Our income doesn't influence their demand. Their demand depends on their income. And since their income isn't in this picture, then showing exports is just another upwards parallel shift in the line. The line shifts upwards, parallel again, and we just added on another autonomous component of spending, exports. Now, this is only half the story. This is what foreigners are buying from us. Now what we have to subtract from this picture is what we're buying from them. Why are we subtracting it? We're subtracting it because our imports are already written in this picture. That is, our imports are either purchased by consumers when they import oranges from Mexico, or by businesses when they import computers from Canada, or by the government whenever it imports concrete from Colombia, whatever. So what we do is we look at the fact that imported goods are already registering in consumer spending, business spending, and government spending. So if we want to find the total demand for domestically produced products, we have to subtract imports from this total spending in our economy. Now, we're going to make an assumption about imports, and that is that imports depend on the level of income. That is, every time your income goes up by $1, consumers spend part of that extra dollar on imported goods. So let's suppose that that number is 10%. So for every dollar worth of additional income that a household gets, that they're going to spend 10 cents of it on imported goods. Now, what that does is, if we want to now look at this line as representing the demand for domestically produced goods and services, we have to reduce the slope of this line by 10%. So reduce the slope. Previously, the slope of this line was 90%. Now it's 90% minus 10%, or 80%. What we've done is we've subtracted imports, because of every dollar that households get in income, they're going to spend 90 cents of it, but they're only spending 80 cents of it on domestically produced goods and services. The remaining 10 cents is going outside our economy as spending on imports, and that has to be subtracted, because imports are goods that are not produced in our economy, not creating income for local factors of production. So there you have it. The curve gets a flatter slope, and the intersection point with the spending equals income line, the intersection point with the equilibrium line, is now going to be at a point closer to the origin, because we moved right here from an economy with no imports to an economy with imports. And the spending abroad, the fact that some of our goods and services are purchased from abroad, reduces the amount of production that domestic factories have to do to keep up with demand. Remember, what we're looking for here is the amount of local production and income that is needed to support the spending plans of the economy. And the more people are importing, the less has to be produced domestically to give us an equilibrium. So, in an open economy, what you get is a flatter aggregate expenditure line, because the more people are inclined to import, the less domestic production needs to be done to keep up with demand. This then raises the question of the multiplier. What is the multiplier like in an economy with imports? Well, remember, the multiplier says that whenever I buy an orange from Florida, I'm creating income from Florida orange workers. They then spend the money on compact discs and haircuts and T-shirts, and those merchants in turn go out and spend this new income on other consumer goods and services. But if I imported this orange from Mexico, there is no multiplier effect in the U.S. economy. There's a multiplier effect in Mexico, but we're not studying Mexico's economy, so we can ignore that. The multiplier effect in the U.S. economy is lost when the good is imported rather than produced domestically. So think about then the effect that imports have on the multiplier. It's a kind of leakage. Every dime that's spent on imported goods is a dime that's lost to the multiplier process in this economy. It's a dime that doesn't become local income and therefore isn't passed on in local spending. To see how imports affect the multiplier, let's start with the closed economy multiplier. Remember that it comes from a geometric sequence. When you spend $1, you create $1 worth of income for someone else who spends a fraction of that, and the fraction is equal to the marginal propensity to consume. Then the person who gets his money spends a fraction of it. So you get 1 plus the marginal propensity to consume plus MPC squared and so forth. And when you add up all of this infinite sequence, you get a number that converges to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So if the marginal propensity to consume is 90% of each additional dollar, then the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus 90%, or 1 over 10%, which is 10. Now, in an open economy, you get an additional leakage at each step in this story. So, for instance, if I go to the store to buy some flowers, the flower merchant gets $1 from me. The flower merchant then is inclined to spend 90% of the dollar's worth of income, but he's only inclined to spend some of it on locally produced goods. Suppose the marginal propensity to import, or MPM, is 10%. That means if the flower merchant wants to spend 90% of the money that I gave him, we have to subtract 10% of that amount, which is the amount that he's going to spend on imported goods. The multiplier is the money that he spends that goes to someone locally. So here we have MPC minus MPM. He's only spending 80 cents of my original dollar that I gave him on locally produced goods. So 80 cents goes to someone else, say the ice cream merchant that the flower merchant buys ice cream from. Then he gets 80 cents, of which he spends 90%, but only 80% on locally produced goods. Maybe he buys a T-shirt from the merchant next door, as well as spending some of the money on imported oranges. So what you get then is a geometric sequence with 1 plus 80% plus 80% squared, and so forth. It's just like the previous story, only the number is smaller. It's reduced by the amount of money that flows out of the economy in the form of imports. So the new multiplier for the open economy is 1 over 1 minus this sum. And the sum is the marginal propensity to consume minus the amount that's spent on imported goods, the marginal propensity to import. Exactly the same idea, a geometric sequence, a chain reaction, everybody playing their role, a step in the story, only this time we're reducing the amount passed on at each stage by the amount that's spent on imported goods. So the multiplier is smaller in this case. 1 over 1 minus 90% minus 10%, or 80%. 1 minus 80% is 20%. The multiplier was just reduced down to 5. 1 over 20% is 5. So our open economy multiplier is smaller than the closed economy multiplier, because when people spend money outside of your economy, they are reducing the multiplier effect. They're reducing the amount of income that's created for local goods and local factors of production at each stage, and that reduces local demand for goods and services. So there you have it. In an open economy, the multiplier is smaller because imported goods, while they're good for your standard of living, will shrink domestic income because they reduce the multiplier effect. More income goes abroad to foreign countries, and that's great for the foreign countries. However, from a macroeconomist point of view, you get a smaller punch now from increased government spending whenever people in your economy are inclined to spend a chunk of their extra income on imported goods. Now we're going to consider foreign trade more broadly and look at how economists do the accounting of imports and exports and what this means for measuring economic activity.
Hi guys. Welcome back to my channel, the best place for who wants to be a better player in the global market. In this video, I'm showing international trade for beginners. I think you are going to get some really good ideas. The possibilities are truly endless when it comes to building your business and be your own boss. What is international trade? International trade basically refers to the exchange of goods and services carried out between countries. It has been a part of life for centuries now. Ancient civilizations like the Greek and Roman empires carried out trade with neighboring nations. Global trade arises out of the variations in product availability in different countries of the world as well as what is referred to as comparative advantage. In the current state of the world, technological innovations have led to globalization and made the world a borderless whole, open to all forms of trade at all possible levels. No single country can isolate itself from the whole and work towards self-sufficiency. A brief history of international trade. International trade has a very rich heritage steeped in humble beginnings. It started out with barter trade and went on to the mercantile system towards the end of the 17th century. Mercantilism basically promoted balanced trade that required the value of exports of a given country at any time to exceed that of imports in the same period. Profitability was calculated based on the difference between exports and imports and was referred to as the balance of trade surplus. This system paid particular concern to the commodities comprising international trade. On this basis, exporting finished products was considered beneficial, but exporting raw materials was frowned upon. The reverse was also true, importation of raw materials being favored over that of finished products. The system was therefore highly interventionist, with governments seeking to manipulate international trading activities in their home country's favor. This led to the next stage of liberalism in the 18th century, during which Adam Smith wrote his book The Wealth of Nations. This book explained the important role of specialized production, a theory that formed the foundation for David Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. Comparative advantage is a law in economics that states that every country should specialize in a certain category of products to sell to others in export and import everything else for local consumption. This is what makes it possible for everyone around the world to access goods that might otherwise have been inaccessible. These were essential steps in bringing the mercantilist system to an end and ushering the world into a new economic era. Towards the start of the 19th century, the world adopted professionalism, but this too died down after some time. By the year 1913, gold was an internationally accepted medium of exchange and there was increased freedom for traders operating across borders. Even though the First World War temporarily reversed the situation, currency fluctuations and economic recession soon got things back to normal. In 1927, the League of Nations organized the World Economic Conference and oversaw the development of the Multilateral Trade Agreement. With time, countries came to the realization that International Trade Organization regulations could not hold relevance for extended periods. This brought the rise of unique regulations in terms of trade for different countries that were updated every so often to keep up with changing trends. International trade today is fully functional, with every market still using the comparative advantage principle to choose their import and export product list. This makes it easy for traders to identify and focus on the products and services that allow them the most profitability. Unique benefits of international trade. International trade offers lots of advantages to individuals and countries as well. This is the main reason why the business has thrived over the years in spite of challenges. Let us take a look at some of the most outstanding benefits associated with it. Lower product costs. This benefit results from two major reasons. First, it is easier for manufacturers to produce goods overseas at lower prices. This is especially the case in large manufacturing zones like China, where economies of scale reduce production costs significantly. This advantage is passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices. A second way in which this is achieved is through high competition. In the past, when one company had a monopoly over a large area, they would take advantage of this and charge whatever prices they deemed fit. But in many cases today, there are numerous traders from different countries fighting to offer the best possible prices. High competition consistently brings prices down to the least possible profitable price. Efficiency in production processes. High competition also forces manufacturers to try and offer the most efficiency in their operations. Some choose to come up with new ways to produce the same products. Others opt to improve existing processes for optimal efficiency. More efficient processes usually result in lower energy consumption, decreased use of raw materials, lower labor costs, and many other advantages. This boon is again passed on to the consumer and they get higher quality products for lower prices. This often leads to more eco-friendly processes that reduce their toll on the environment. Product variety. Climate changes and other environmental factors greatly limit the kind of food we can access during any given season. This would mean going without a favorite fruit or other food product for as long as conditions are unfavorable for its growth or processing. But international trade has made it possible to access almost anything all year round. It has also made it possible for less developed nations to gain from the technology and their more advanced counterparts. This is why almost everyone in the world now has access to electronic products like cell phones, TV sets, washing machines, refrigerators, laptops, among others, regardless of their location. This has served to improve the living standards of those in isolated places or third world countries that do not manufacture such items. Market for surplus produce. This benefit comes in handy particularly for agricultural-based economies. Farm produce is inherently perishable and you have a surplus of it, you either need to get market fast or watch it rot. There are countries whose climate and geological conditions highly favor the production of one kind of food. This makes farmers tend to concentrate on that particular product as they are sure it will excel. But when it does excel and everyone has an abundance of it, then they are forced to sell at throwaway prices just to get rid of the surplus. With the export market ever at the ready, however, this no longer has to be the case. There is almost always a market that needs that surplus product and a means to get it there. The same is true for manufactured products. At times production companies flood the market with similar product and supply overwhelms demand. At such times, overseas markets take the excess and keep the manufacturers profitable. Market fluctuation management. All markets in every part of the world are subjects to highs and lows. There are certain periods of the year, for instance, when the demand for warm winter clothing is at an all-time high. But when summer comes, no one needs them anymore and suppliers would have to rest till the next winter comes around. However, on the international market, there has to be at least one country that needs the warm clothing at any given time. This makes it easy for suppliers to remain in business all year round, moving with the season to take advantage of demand. This has really helped traders to mitigate the effects of seasonal sales fluctuations and enjoy sustainable profitability and growth. Risks associated with international trade. Like any other business, international trade also has its fair share of challenges. In fact, due to the sheer size of the market, these are often magnified beyond expectation. Consider the most outstanding ones. Buyer risks. As a new international trader, you might have to search long and hard for your first buyers. The result of such a hard search is that at times caution is thrown to the wind and judgment impaired. Desperation might creep in and make you forget to exercise diligence in verifying new clients. If you happen to engage a crook, you might suffer shock when after making a delivery you receive no payment and leave no trace of their existence online. Seller risks. Seller risks are also magnified by virtue of the scope and volume of trade as well as distances involved. A manufacturer might fail to supply the right quantity of goods or might delay in making the delivery due to a variety of reasons. They might also fail to supply desired quality of products and compromise on your business reputation. Third-party risks. The import-export business is highly dependent on factors that are beyond your control. For instance, you might get a bill of exchange endorsed or a bank guarantee for payment of goods. But when the time comes, they might fail to honor the agreement for one reason or another. You might have taken insurance cover over your goods in transit. But in the event of loss, it turns out that the amount you took out does not fully cover your expenses, leading to loss. Other third parties like inspection companies, shippers, customs agents and others might also fail in their loss and cause you loss inadvertently. Geographical risks. A country's location may also severely impact your international trade deal. Country risks could take the form of political upheavals, economic downturns and conflicts. Asia international trade has many times presented this challenge to traders due to instability in some countries in any one or all three of the above sectors. At times also, government policies change before the completion of a trade deal and complicate matters. Countries with financial volatility are also subject to frequent currency fluctuations that could turn a profitable transaction into a complete loss. How to start an international business. You might have figured out the dynamics of running a local business venture. But as you can tell from the above risks, running an international operation is not for the faint of heart. The most reassuring part of it is that no business, however small, comes completely risk-free. Furthermore, most of the challenges outlined above can be surmounted. Take a look at the essential steps in setting up your import-export business that will improve your odds of success. Prepare. One of the first steps to setting up any business is adequate preparation. In this case, you need to prepare a business plan that takes into consideration your international market. This will help you to assess your needs and set objectives. Market research. Carry out foreign market research using the resources available online and at your local chamber of commerce. This will help you figure out what products would perform well in which markets and the complexities of getting there. Evaluate distribution methods. There are as many different distribution strategies as there are product varieties. Establish the most viable method of getting your products to the intended market. This could be through intermediaries like agents, distributors, or agents. You could also opt for a joint venture with a company in that market or even set up a foreign subsidiary. Regulations and legal aspects. This is often the toughest part of the international business setup process. Every market has a distinct set of regulations to govern the trade. These rules are ever evolving and you need a reliable way to stay ahead of developments or risk incurring penalties. Do not forget to subscribe to my channel. Like, comment, and share with your friends. I appreciated all your support. Enjoy your journey.
Hi, today we're going to be dealing with one of the deepest ideas in economics, comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is a theory of trade. It explains why people trade and which goods people should trade if they want to maximize their well-being. It's actually useful to understand comparative advantage to begin with a false theory, a very plausible but incorrect theory of trade, namely the theory of absolute advantage. So let's consider a simple model. Let's suppose that labor is the only good used in production and that we can produce computers or shirts. Now let's suppose that in Mexico it takes 12 units of labor to produce one computer. And again in Mexico it takes 2 units of labor to produce one shirt. Now let's compare with the United States. To make it simple, we'll suppose that in the United States it takes just 1 unit of labor to make one computer and 1 unit of labor to create one shirt. Now, from the absolute advantage theory of trade, it may seem obvious that there in fact will be no trade here. It may seem obvious that the United States will outcompete Mexico on all margins. After all, the United States, in this example, is much more productive at producing computers and also more productive at producing shirts than Mexico. So this is a case where we might think, well, the United States is so much better at producing both computers and shirts that certainly there's no reason for the United States to trade with Mexico, its less productive neighbor. That's the theory of absolute advantage. It's very plausible. It's also very wrong. To see why it's wrong, let's take another simple example. Here's a picture of Martha Stewart ironing her shirt. Now, let's stipulate that Martha Stewart has an absolute advantage in ironing. She has an advantage in ironing just like the United States had an advantage in producing computers and shirts in the previous example. In other words, we'll stipulate that Martha Stewart can iron a shirt better and in less time than anyone else. So, if Martha Stewart has an absolute advantage in ironing, should Martha Stewart iron her own shirts? And of course the answer here is no. Why not? Well, every hour which Martha Stewart spends ironing her shirts is an hour she's not spending doing something else which is even more valuable, running her own business, for example, running her billion-dollar business. And in fact, in a famous statement, Martha Stewart, because she's very wise, she said, "I don't always do all of my own ironing, even though I wish that I could." Let's take a little bit more detail about why it doesn't make sense for Martha Stewart to iron her own shirts. The most important point to remember is that the important cost is opportunity cost. So what is the opportunity cost to Martha Stewart of spending an hour ironing her own shirts? Well, it could be thousands of dollars, at least. Martha Stewart will be better off if she specializes in producing her television show and then she trades with someone else who has a lower opportunity cost of ironing. It doesn't make sense for Martha Stewart to iron her own shirts because the cost of her doing so is devoting her time to something where she's even more valuable, where she's even better, and that is producing her own television show. So Martha Stewart has a comparative advantage in running her business. Or to put it slightly differently, she has a comparative disadvantage in ironing. The cost to her of ironing is very high precisely because she is so much more productive at other tasks. So Martha Stewart wants to specialize in what she is most best at, in where she has a comparative advantage. Other people are almost as good as her at ironing clothes, but they're not as good as her at producing her own TV show. So that's why Martha Stewart shouldn't iron her own shirts. Let's go back now to our previous example of the United States and Mexico. So the key to comparative advantage is understanding opportunity cost. So let's take this previous figure we had from a previous slide and turn it into an opportunity cost figure. So remember what this top figure tells us. It tells us, for example, that in Mexico it takes 12 units of labor to produce one computer, and in Mexico it takes 2 units of labor to produce one shirt, and so forth. Okay? For the United States, it just takes 1 unit of labor to produce either a computer or a shirt. Okay. Now, let's begin with an easy case. What's the opportunity cost of one computer in the United States? In other words, to produce an additional computer in the United States, what would we have to give up? Well, in order to get that additional computer, we'd have to take labor from shirt production and move it into computer production. And in particular, we'd have to take 1 unit of labor from shirt production and move it into computer production. That would get us one more computer at the cost of 1 shirt. So the opportunity cost of 1 computer in the United States is 1 shirt. Well, what's the opportunity cost of a shirt? Well, the opportunity cost of a shirt, what you're giving up to produce an extra shirt, is 1 computer. Okay. Slightly harder case. What's the opportunity cost of 1 computer in Mexico? So in Mexico, in order to get an additional computer, you'd have to transfer labor from shirt production into computer production. Okay? But how many units of labor you need to transfer? You need to transfer 12 units of labor. In order to get 1 computer, you're going to have to take 12 units of labor from shirt production. That means how many fewer shirts? Since it takes 2 units of labor to produce 1 shirt, and you've got to move 12 units of labor, it means that the opportunity cost of 1 computer is 6 shirts. If you need an additional computer, it's going to cost you 6 fewer shirts in order to get that computer. And going the other way, in order to get an additional shirt, you're going to have to give up 1/6 of a computer. Okay, so now we have our opportunity costs. And now it's actually pretty simple, because what the theory of comparative advantage says is that you should produce what you can produce at lowest cost. Okay? So who here has the lowest cost of producing a computer? The lowest cost of producing a computer is the United States. The United States is the low opportunity cost producer of computers. Now, who is the low cost producer of shirts? Well, it's Mexico. In Mexico, you're only giving up 1/6 of a computer to produce a shirt. In the United States, you're giving up 1 computer to produce a shirt. So you'd much rather produce shirts in Mexico, where the opportunity cost is lower. Okay. So what we're learning here is that Mexico ought to specialize in computers because they're the low-cost producer of, in shirts, because they're the low-cost producer of shirts. The United States ought to specialize more towards computers because they're the low-cost producer of computers. Let's look in more detail. So I'm going to leave some of the details to you, actually, in some homework questions, which we'll go over in a future video. So question 1. Let's suppose that Mexico and the United States each have 24 units of labor, and that they each devote 12 units of labor to producing computers and 12 units of labor to producing shirts. That will be our baseline scenario. So the question is, what is total world production in this scenario? That's question one. Question two, suppose that Mexico specializes in producing what it produces at lowest opportunity cost. We just saw that with shirts. And suppose that the U.S. transfers 2 units of labor from shirts to producing what it produces at lowest opportunity cost. That's computers. What it then is total world production. Finally, can trade make both countries better off? And here what I'd like you to do is give a concrete example of how many units have to be traded from where to where in order to make both countries better off, if that in fact is possible. So to help you along a little bit, I know that was a mouthful, let's take a look at this in terms of a diagram. To help you along, I want you to fill in these tables. So our basic table from which you're going to draw the information is up here. If both countries have 24 units of labor, half devoted to computers, half to shirts, there's no trade, so production is equal to consumption in this first example. What is production going to be? So Mexico, 12 units of labor for computers, 12 shirts. How many computers, how many shirts? Same for the United States. How many computers, how many shirts? What's total world production? Then suppose we have specialization. What's production going to be? So Mexico has 0 units of labor in computers, 24 in shirts. The United States has 14 units of labor in computers, 10 in shirts. What's production in each case? What is the total for the world? And then finally, can we, with production with specialization, can we now find a way to have trade which makes both countries better off? And what's the exact, or what's a exact price ratio at which that trade will occur? We'll take that up in a later video. Let me just finally give you some concluding comments on comparative advantage. I want to conclude with a caution, but also a big picture view of comparative advantage. In the 2 country-person examples I've been working with in order to explain the theory, everyone is made better off by trade. In larger examples, trade will increase aggregate wealth, but some individuals can be made worse off. And that should make perfect sense. After all, if A and B have been trading, and then because tariffs fall or because transportation costs fall, if A starts trading with C, then B may be worse off, even though A, B, and C together have greater aggregate wealth. That's just a caution to keep in mind. Now here's the big picture. Comparative advantage. It applies to people, to groups, to countries. It's sometimes called the law of association. And it's not only a beautiful theory, it's a very positive and optimistic theory, because it says that we all have something to gain from trade. It says by working together we can increase total wealth. Moreover, we can I like to phrase this in terms of a politically correct slogan. Diversity is strength. You've probably heard that slogan before. What comparative advantage adds to this is that diversity is strength when combined with trade. It's trade which turns diversity into strength. That's really the bottom line on comparative advantage. We'll be saying more in future videos. Thanks.
Hello. In this video, we're going to review the basics of trade, talking about issues such as comparative advantage, specialization, and we're going to start this example by assuming we have 2 countries, the United States and Japan. Each country can produce 2 goods, grain and steel. The United States, production possibilities frontier is given up here in the top left. If we allocate all our resources to producing nothing but grain in the United States, we could produce 100 units of grain. If we allocate all our resources to the production of steel, we could produce 50 units of steel. We're going to assume that the United States will produce a combination of grain and steel where we're producing 60 units of grain and 20 units of steel, a point on the PPF curve. Japan likewise can produce grain and steel. If Japan allocates all its resources to grain production, it can produce 40 units of grain. If it allocates all its resources to the production of steel, it can produce 40 units of steel. We're going to assume that Japan locates on its PPF at a point right here, highlighted by this point, which corresponds to 30 units of grain and 10 units of steel. Usually the first thing we want to do in these types of problems is figure out who has a comparative advantage in which good. The way to do that is to construct a simple table, like I've shown here. And we're basically trying to calculate the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of something. In this case, one more unit of steel and one more unit of grain, the two goods in question. So in this first column here, I have the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of steel. In the United States, the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of steel is going to be 2 units of grain. In other words, every time we produce one more unit of steel in the United States, the cost comes in giving up the opportunity of producing 2 units of grain. The way I calculated that answer is by using that formula that I talked about in the previous video, where we take what you give up and divide it by what you get. In the United States, what we give up in producing steel is 100 units of grain. What do we get? 50 units of steel. So 100 divided by 50 is where the answer 2 is coming from. In Japan, we're going to calculate the opportunity cost the same way. In Japan, what we give up if we're producing steel is 40 units of grain. What do we get in return? In Japan, if we give up producing 40 units of grain, what do we get? 40 units of steel, so 40 divided by 40 is just 1 unit of grain. So maybe I'll just write that here. And that's where the 2 came from. Now, to examine the opportunity cost of producing the other item, in this case grain, it's what you give up divided by what you get. If we're producing nothing but grain in the United States, we're giving up producing 50 units of steel. What are we getting back? The 100 units of grain. 50 divided by 100 gives us the opportunity cost of 1/2. Every time we produce one more grain, in other words, one more unit of grain, in other words, we give up producing 1/2 unit of steel. For Japan, if we're producing nothing but grain, we are producing, we're giving up producing 40 units of steel. We're getting 40 units of grain, so the opportunity cost is 1 unit of steel. Every time we produce one more unit of grain in Japan, we always give up producing 1 unit of steel. So given these values, these numbers, we can now calculate comparative advantage. So let's see who has a comparative advantage in which good. In terms of producing steel, it looks like Japan has a comparative advantage in the production of steel. Every time Japan produces one more unit of steel, it only gives up 1 unit of grain. But the U.S. gives up 2 units of grain. Therefore, Japan is has a comparative advantage in steel production. So let me note that here. Japan's comparative advantage, CA, is in steel production. 1 is less than 2. Now let's see about the production of grain. Who produces grain at the lowest opportunity cost? Well, it appears that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in grain production. Every time you produce one more unit of grain in the United States, you're only giving up 1/2 unit of steel, while in Japan you would have to give up a full unit. So the United States, U.S. has a comparative advantage in grain production. In these problems then, generally what we're going to do next is we're going to assume that each country is going to completely specialize in their comparative advantage, and then they're going to trade with the other country for the good that they don't have a comparative advantage in. So let's go through that analysis now. To finish up this video, I want to show how both countries can benefit from comparative advantage, specialization, and trade. We're going to have a table here at the bottom with several columns. The first set of columns shows the situation, should be without trade. Let me put a O there, without trade. Assuming that the United States and Japan are self-sufficient, not trading with one another, we can assume that the U.S. is going to produce and consume 60 units of grain and 20 units of steel. We're also going to assume that Japan is going to produce and consume 30 units of grain and 10 units of steel. Note at the beginning of the video I
illustrated where those points were located along the production possibilities frontiers. Now we have a next set of columns here that I'm calling the specialization columns. You can assume that each country is going to specialize in their comparative advantage. In the United States case, they're going to do nothing but produce grain. Grain, after all, is what we argued is what the United States has a comparative advantage in. So the United States will produce 100 units of grain, and if the U.S. is producing 100 units of grain, can't produce any steel. Japan is going to specialize in its comparative advantage, which we argued is steel production. So Japan at most can produce 40 units of steel, and if it's producing 40 units of steel, it can't produce any grain. Now what we want to do is to come up with some terms of trade that will basically make both countries better off. So one such terms would be that the United States trades 35 units of grain for 25 units of Japanese steel. So once again, the terms of trade might be that the United States is going to trade 35 units of grain for 25 units of Japanese steel. So if the United States trades away 35 units of grain, it'll have 65 units of grain. Just simply 100 minus 35. What does the United States get back? Well, according to the terms of trade, it'll get back 25 units of steel. Now, from Japan's perspective, Japan is receiving 35 units of grain. Okay, it wasn't producing any grain while it was specializing, so it's going to get 35 units of United States grain. What does it cost Japan to do that? Well, Japan has to trade away 25 units of steel. So 40 minus 25 is 15. Let's examine these trade numbers here at the end. With trade, the United States is consuming 65 units of grain and 25 units of steel. What's interesting about that point, it's going to be a point outside the United States production possibilities frontier. With trade, a country can consume beyond its PPF. Japan, the same thing. This consumption point of 35 units of grain and 15 units of steel is going to be a point that is outside Japan's production possibilities frontier. Trade allows us to have a much larger level of consumption than otherwise would be the case if we were simply self-sufficient. The last thing I want to do in highlighting the benefits of trade is to show you that the U.S. is buying a unit of steel for 35 divided by 25, what you give up divided by what you get again, for only 1.4 units of grain. So the U.S. is buying a unit of steel, in essence, for 1.4 units of grain. If the United States was self-sufficient and didn't trade, it would cost the United States 2 units of grain to produce 1 unit of steel. So the United States is clearly benefiting from this. It's cheaper for the United States simply to buy steel from Japan than to produce it for themselves. In Japan, the same thing. Japan is buying 1 unit of grain for 25 divided by 35, what you give up divided by what you get, or 0.71 units of steel. It costs Japan 1 unit of steel to produce 1 unit of grain. So it's simply cheaper for Japan to get its grain from the United States than to produce it for itself. Okay, I hope you found this video helpful.
In 1817, David Ricardo published his groundbreaking paper on the principles of political economy and taxation. Ricardo laid out the principle of comparative advantage and illustrated it using a simple example that is still used today when teaching this subject. Before Ricardo, the predominant theory of international trade was mercantilism based on absolute advantage. Ricardo showed that 2 countries could gain from trade even if one of them had an absolute advantage at producing every product. Intuitively, it is inefficient for one country to produce everything and the other country to produce nothing. Here are the assumptions of the simple Ricardian trade model. Labor is the only input to production. Labor is immobile. It cannot migrate across borders. However, within a country, labor is completely mobile between industrial sectors. Labor is fully employed. Regarding markets, we assume two outputs, perfectly competitive markets, and no transportation, trade, or other transactions costs. Technology exhibits constant returns to scale, and we assume no changes in technology or skills. Labor productivity is defined as units of output divided by hours worked. For example, if 4 loaves of bread can be produced by one worker in 2 hours, labor productivity is 2 loaves per hour. We usually assume output prices reflect costs. We use the terms price and cost interchangeably. Assume there are 2 countries, the U.S. and Canada, and there are 2 goods, bread and steel. Productivity in each country is summarized in this table. Canada has an absolute productive advantage in bread production, but the U.S. has an absolute productive advantage in steel. The production possibilities curve, PPC, shows the combinations of 2 goods a country can produce given current technology and available resources, labor, capital, raw materials, etc. The PPC for the U.S. shows the combinations of bread and steel that the economy can produce. Points like B that lie on the PPC are efficient. All resources are being used to produce the largest possible quantities of bread and steel. This is often called full employment output. Remember, in economics, cost means opportunity cost, what is given up to increase another activity by 1 unit. The slope of the PPC tells us how many loaves of bread we must give up to produce 1 more ton of steel. In other words, the slope of the PPC is the cost of producing 1 more ton of steel in units of loaves of bread. Points like A that lie below the PPC are inefficient. Some resources are not being used. The quantity produced of, say, bread can be increased without decreasing output of the other good. We often say there are unemployed resources. Points like C that lie above the PPC are infeasible. Given currently available resources and technology, those quantities of bread and steel cannot be produced. The only ways to achieve output above the PPC are to acquire more resources and/or improve technology. The consumption possibilities curve, CPC, shows the quantity of bread needed to buy 1 more ton of steel at the world price. The U.S. can sell steel and buy bread at world prices, allowing it to consume at points along the CPC. However, it would be foolish to consume on any point such as X. That point lies below the PPC. The U.S. would be better off just consuming on the PPC instead of trading to point X. If the U.S. chooses to trade, it can move up the CPC, trading each ton of steel for 2 loaves of bread. Compare trade with autarky, the complete absence of trade. Under autarky, each country can only consume what it produces. Trade is better than autarky. Under autarky, giving up a ton of steel only produces 2/3 of a loaf of bread, but with trade, giving up a ton of steel produces 2 loaves of bread. In effect, the U.S. can consume outside its PPC by trading. Why would the U.S. produce any bread at all? If the U.S. produced only steel, it would trade at 2 loaves of bread per ton. Every ton of steel not produced by the U.S. creates only 2/3 of a loaf of bread. The U.S. should completely specialize in steel production. Production will be at point B. By producing at point B, the U.S. can trade along CPC prime to a point like C. Note that economic welfare has unambiguously improved because consumption of both goods has increased. Production at point B maximizes U.S. income because the CPC line at that point is the farthest possible from the origin while still in contact with the PPC. Point C is clearly superior to any point on either the PPC or the original CPC that passes through point A. At point C, more of both goods is being consumed, an unambiguous improvement in economic welfare.